They called her just a radar operator and ignored her warnings about the incoming threat. The hotshot F-15 Eagle pilots at Langley Air Force Base thought they knew better than some woman staring at screens all day, until the enemy aircraft appeared exactly where she predicted. And suddenly, everyone realized the radar girl had been tracking aircraft longer than they'd been alive. The morning fog hung low over Langley Air Force Base as Captain Sarah Chen settled into her position at the Air Defense Control Center. Banks of radar screens glowed green in the dimly lit room, displaying aircraft movements across hundreds of miles of airspace. To the F-15 Eagle pilots preparing for their morning intercept training, she was just another faceless voice in their headsets, someone who read coordinates and vectors while they did the real flying. At 29 years old, with her hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun, Sarah looked like every other radar operator the pilots had worked with over the year. They heard her call sign, Watchdog, over the radio daily, providing navigation assistance and traffic advisories, but most barely considered the person behind the voice. Her workstation was tucked away in the corner of the control center, surrounded by technical manuals and coffee cups, the kind of setup that screamed support personnel to anyone who glanced her way. What they didn't know was that Sarah had started her Air Force career as an F-15 pilot herself. For 5 years, she'd flown Eagle missions over hostile territory, intercepting enemy aircraft and providing air superiority for ground operations. Her logbook contained over 800 hours in the F-15C, including 120 combat missions over Afghanistan and northern Iraq. Her transition to radar operations hadn't been voluntary. A training accident had damaged her inner ear, ending her flying career, but leaving her with an understanding of aerial combat that few controllers possessed. The medical board's decision had been final: permanent grounding due to spatial disorientation issues that made high-G maneuvering dangerous. Instead of leaving the Air Force, Sarah had chosen to retrain as an air surveillance officer, believing her pilot experience would make her a better controller. She was right, but convincing pilots to trust her guidance proved more challenging than mastering the radar systems. The morning's exercise called for simulated intercept training against aggressor aircraft playing the role of enemy fighters. 2 F-15C Eagles would practice beyond visual range combat, using their powerful APG-70 radars to track and engage targets at maximum distance. Standard procedure for pilots who'd completed this scenario dozens of times, though none with the tactical complexity Sarah was observing on her screen. Lieutenant Mark Stevens led the formation, fresh from F-15 training with barely 300 hours in the Eagle's cockpit. His wingman, Lieutenant Torres, had similar experience level. Both were confident in their abilities and eager to demonstrate their skills against the aggressor squadron. Stevens had graduated near the top of his pilot training class and possessed the kind of self-assurance that came with natural flying ability and minimal real-world experience. Watchdog, Falcon Flight checking in for intercept training, Stevens radioed as his formation climbed through 15,000 feet, their twin F-100 engines leaving contrails in the humid Virginia air. Sarah studied her displays carefully, noting contacts that were barely visible on the long-range surveillance radar. Years of experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signatures that indicated aircraft using sophisticated counter-detection techniques. Falcon Flight, Watchdog copies. Be advised, I'm tracking multiple contacts bearing 285 degrees, range 180 miles, altitude unknown. Recommend vector 270 for initial intercept geometry. Stevens glanced at his radar display, which showed empty airspace in that direction. The F-15's APG-70 radar was powerful, but it had limitations at extreme range, especially against targets using electronic countermeasures. Watchdog, we're not seeing any contacts on our scopes. Are you sure about that bearing? Sarah double-checked her displays, cross-referencing data from multiple radar sites. The contacts were definitely there, faint and intermittent, but displaying flight characteristics she recognized from her combat flying days. Falcon Flight, positive contact, multiple aircraft using terrain masking and electronic countermeasures. Recommend immediate vector change to optimize intercept geometry. Negative, Watchdog, Stevens replied with the casual dismissal she'd heard countless times before. We'll stick to the planned route, probably just weather returns you're seeing on those old ground radars. In the control center, Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being ignored by pilots who trusted their own limited perspective over her comprehensive surveillance picture. She'd been in Stevens's position once, confident in her aircraft's capabilities and skeptical of ground-based guidance. The difference was that she'd learned through hard experience that individual aircraft radars, however sophisticated, couldn't match the broader situational awareness provided by integrated defense systems. She watched the contacts continue their approach, their flight pattern clearly indicating hostile intent in a real-world scenario. The aggressor aircraft were using classic penetration tactics: low altitude to avoid radar detection, electronic jamming to mask their signatures, and coordinated timing to achieve simultaneous threat axis convergence. During her flying days, she'd seen this exact tactical setup used by enemy aircraft attempting to penetrate air defenses over contested territory. Falcon Flight. Watchdog strongly advises Vector 270. Contacts are maintaining radio silence and using jamming techniques consistent with hostile approach. They're setting up for a classic pincer movement that will give them first shot advantage. Stevens's voice carried clear irritation. Watchdog, we're the pilots up here. We know what we're seeing on our screens. Continue standard vectors as briefed. Sarah realized she was fighting the same battle she'd encountered for 3 years in this position. Pilots, especially younger ones, often viewed controller guidance as interference rather than assistance. They'd been trained to trust their instruments and their training, which was appropriate most of the time. But this scenario required understanding tactical patterns that could only be recognized with broader perspective and extensive combat experience. She continued tracking the approaching aircraft, noting their systematic approach to achieving tactical surprise. The aggressor squadron was executing a textbook multi-axis attack, using terrain features and electronic warfare to remain undetected until the last possible moment. In a real combat situation, the F-15 pilots would already be in serious danger. 20 minutes later, the enemy aircraft appeared on the F-15 pilot's radar simultaneously, exactly where Sarah had predicted, but now at close range with optimal firing positions and tactical advantage. The aggressor squadron had used terrain masking and electronic warfare techniques to approach undetected, achieving the kind of surprise that would be fatal in real combat. Falcon Lead, you're spiked, came the call from the exercise controller, indicating that the aggressor aircraft had achieved radar lock and simulated missile launch. Falcon 2, you're also spiked. Exercise terminated, aggressor successful. The silence on the radio frequency was telling. Both F-15 pilots had been shot down because they'd ignored guidance from their controller. Stevens and Torres had fallen victim to exactly the kind of tactical scenario Sarah had warned them about, losing the engagement before they'd even realized they were in a fight. After landing, Stevens and Torres made their way to the debriefing room with considerably less swagger than they'd displayed during pre-flight preparation. Sarah was waiting with radar tapes of the entire exercise, having prepared a detailed reconstruction of the tactical development they had missed. The recording showed clear evidence of the approaching aircraft from the moment she'd first detected them, including their use of coordinated electronic warfare and terrain masking. The tactical picture was obvious to anyone who understood what to look for, but nearly invisible to pilots focused on their individual radar scopes. How did you see them when our radars couldn't? Torres asked, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity and a healthy dose of humility. Sarah advanced the radar playbook, highlighting the faint contacts and demonstrating how their behavior patterns indicated hostile intent long before they became visible to airborne radars. Ground-based radar systems have advantages that airborne systems don't. We can use multiple antenna arrays, process signals from different angles, and maintain continuous coverage without the limitations of aircraft movement and altitude restrictions. Stevens studied the display, seeing tactical patterns he'd completely missed during the flight. The aggressor aircraft had been visible to ground radar for over 30 minutes before appearing on his scope, giving ample time for countermeasures if he'd trusted his controller's guidance. But how did you know they were using hostile tactics? This looked like random aircraft movement to me. For the first time, Sarah's professional demeanor shifted slightly. Because I've seen this approach pattern before. From the cockpit. Multiple times actually in actual combat situations where the aircraft trying to surprise us weren't playing games. Both pilots stared at her in shock. You're a pilot? Was a pilot. F-15 Eagle driver for 5 years, including combat deployments over Afghanistan and Iraq. I flew 120 combat missions, including air-to-air intercepts against aircraft using the same penetration tactics your aggressors employed today. I know what enemy approach patterns look like because I've flown against them and used them myself during dissimilar air combat training. The revelation completely changed the atmosphere in the debriefing room. Stevens realized he'd been dismissing tactical guidance from someone with more F-15 combat experience than he'd probably ever accumulate. Torres understood that he'd been ignoring advice from someone who'd actually used F-15s to shoot down enemy aircraft in real combat situations. "Why didn't you tell us?" Torres asked, still processing the implications of what he'd just learned. "Because my job now is radar operations, not flying. But experience doesn't disappear just because your role changes." Sarah pulled up additional displays showing aircraft movements over the past month, demonstrating pattern recognition that came from years of studying aerial tactics. "I've been tracking the aggressor squadron's training pattern. They always use the same terrain masking techniques, approaching from valleys that block radar coverage from certain angles. They're good at what they do, but they're also predictable if you know what to look for." Stevens looked at the tactical picture with completely new understanding. You knew exactly where they'd come from, and when and how they'd attempt their approach, and what electronic warfare techniques they'd use to mask their approach. The F-15 is an incredible aircraft, probably the best air superiority fighter ever built, but it's only as good as the information fed to its pilot. Ground control exists to provide that bigger picture that no single cockpit can achieve. The discussion continued for over an hour, with Sarah explaining tactical concepts that weren't covered in basic pilot training. She demonstrated how ground-based controllers could track aircraft behavior patterns across multiple missions, identifying enemy tactics and predicting future approaches. Her pilot background allowed her to translate radar data into tactical guidance that made sense from a cockpit perspective. Word of the exercise results and Sarah's background spread quickly through the pilot community at Langley. The story of the radar operator who'd predicted the entire engagement while the pilots ignored her warnings became required study material for new F-15 crews. More importantly, it became a case study in the importance of integrated air defense operations. The next week, Stevens and Torres specifically requested Sarah as their controller for training missions. Her tactical guidance proved invaluable, helping them understand how to use their F-15's capabilities within the broader context of air defense systems. She taught them to recognize the limitations of their onboard systems and trust the broader perspective available through ground control. But the most significant change was in how pilots throughout the wing interacted with all their controllers. They began asking questions instead of dismissing advice, understanding that the voices in their headsets often possessed experience and knowledge that complemented their own flying skills. The culture shift improved the effectiveness of the entire air defense system. Sarah never sought to return to flying status, despite medical advances that might have made it possible. She'd found purpose in her new role, using her pilot experience to make other aviators more effective and safer. The F-15 Eagle remained one of the world's most capable air superiority fighters, but its success depended on the entire air defense system working together as an integrated whole. During advanced tactical training sessions, she would often remind pilots that the Eagle's greatest strength wasn't its radar or missiles or speed, but its ability to process information from multiple sources and make split-second decisions based on complete situational awareness rather than limited individual perspective. The F-15 can defeat any enemy aircraft in the world, she would tell new pilots during their initial briefings, but only if the pilot listens to all available information sources and understands their place in the larger air defense picture. Pride and assumption are the only things that can shoot down an Eagle.